Chapter 15, A Divided Nation, Section 2, Trouble in Kansas. We're going to start with the election of 1852. Two main candidates in this election. The first one was Franklin Pierce. He was nominated by the Democrats because he promised to honor the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. So Southerners actually trusted him. The other candidate was Winfield Scott. He was the nomination from the Whig Party, and that's because he was a war hero. That was typical with the Whigs. They always nominated a war hero. And he was a war hero in the Mexican War. However, Southerners did not trust Winfield Scott because he had not fully supported the Compromise of 1850. So because of that, Franklin Pierce is going to win by a large margin. Here is Franklin Pierce right here. That's Winfield Scott right on over here. Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, had introduced a bill in Congress to divide the remainder of the Louisiana Territory into two separate territories, one called Kansas, one called Nebraska. The reason why he did this is because he wanted to run a railroad to the Pacific starting in Chicago. Now, there have been two plans put out there. One would be a southern route starting in New Orleans to California, and then you have this more centrally located route starting in Chicago going out to California. Southerners in Congress said that they would support the railroad starting in Chicago going over into California if slavery would be allowed in these territories north of that Missouri Compromise line of 3630. Stephen Douglas agreed to it, and he decided to use popular sovereignty to allow each of those territories to decide whether they wanted slavery or not. So each territory would use popular sovereignty to decide on slavery, and by doing that, it essentially eliminated the Missouri Compromise, because if you remember, there's not supposed to be slavery north of that 3630 line. Anyway, the KansasNebraska Act, as it was called, was passed in 1854 with full Southern support. If you look at this map here, look at the map. There's that Missouri Compromise line right here. Okay, follow it. Here are the two territories right here. Nebraska and Kansas, both of them are north of that line. And Stephen Douglas proposed popular sovereignty to decide the slavery issue. Well, as soon as Stephen Douglas got that bill passed through Congress, groups of people started flocking to the territory of Kansas. Anti-slavery people and pro-slavery people both rushed to Kansas to vote on this whole issue of slavery. Pro-slavery voters were actually crossing the border from Missouri into Kansas, voting for slavery, then going back over to Missouri. These groups of people were called border ruffians because they weren't only voting across the border, but they were kind of roughing up some people as well on the way back. But pro-slavery voters crossed the border to vote, which allowed the pro-slavery government to win. And this pro-slavery government created really strict laws about fugitive slaves. Not to be outdone by the pro-slavery people, an anti-slavery group created a second government in Kansas in protest, but President Pierce would only recognize the pro-slavery legislature. Because of the KansasNebraska Act, violence is going to erupt in Kansas. We're going to talk about one event first. It's called the Sack of Lawrence. Lawrence was a anti-slavery city, sometimes known as the capital of the anti-slavery government, between that and Topeka. But regardless, Lawrence was a key anti-slavery city. The pro-slavery grand jury charged the anti-slavery government with treason. So pro-slavery forces went down to Lawrence and attacked the city, killing hundreds of people from Lawrence, or anti-slavery people. If we look at the map of Kansas here, I can zoom in here and get my pencil. Here is Lawrence right here. That's Lawrence. The capital of the pro-slavery people here is Lecompton. Here's Topeka, which is another anti-slavery city. Lecompton's more south. Anyway, that's where the sack of Lawrence took place. Now, in response to the sack of Lawrence, we're back to a guy named John Brown. John Brown was an anti-slavery abolitionist, I suppose. He and his sons went to a pro-slavery town called Pottawatomie Creek. And Brown and his sons pulled 5 pro-slavery men out from their deep slumber, pulled them out to the middle of the street, and killed them. This became known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. So because of these 2 events, the sack of Lawrence and the response by John Brown at the Pottawatomie Massacre, Kansas will erupt into a civil war. Another violent act occurred in Congress. We have a senator, Charles Sumner, who's from Massachusetts, who was criticizing pro-slavery people, and in particular, he was insulting a senator from the South known as Pickens Butler. Well, a nephew of Pickens Butler, his name is Preston Brooks, he's a representative in Congress, heard about this, so he walked right over to the Senate chambers and with his cane beat Charles Sumner unconscious. As you can see in this picture right here, Preston Brooks, Charles Sumner. Wicked beating. That is the end of section 2.